not my fault. It's her drip.
Thank all of you for coming again this evening on this nasty night. I seem to be repeating myself every Thursday night. It's a nasty night. This is the last one of the fall series. We've been fortunate to have wonderful speakers, and I'm sure that this evening we'll be continuing the sequence. We're going to be starting a new series in the spring, in March, and we'll have more information. Those of you who are registered will get the information out to you. I'm repeating myself, and most of you, I think, are people who have been here each time for the benefit of those who haven't. We'll let you know what the topics will be and when they will be held. It will be the same general format as this evening. This evening's speaker, Christina Putch, is Interpretive Specialist with the History Division, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. She is working on, she's completed her dissertation, will be defending it in the spring, and it is on gender and class in 17th century women in Virginia, particular county in Virginia. And she is someone who has a great deal of background in the 17th century, having worked at Plymouth Plantation for 2 years as an interpreter. And I think that she will be sharing some of the celebrations and things that they researched out there this evening, include the traditions that were brought over from England. So what the normal format is that we have a lecture with a break, and we'll have refreshments, and then we'll continue, and at the end we'll have some questions if you would like to ask her anything. So at this time I'd like to introduce Christina.
Well, it's not necessary. Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I take a long day. Thank you, Joyce, for the introduction. I'd like to thank the Historical Society for inviting me tonight. The focus of my topic tonight is on holiday celebrations, and particularly 17th century Thanksgiving tradition. And I think that it's very appropriate that we're doing this tonight because it is the 40th anniversary of the Historical Society. It is also doubly appropriate because it's also my birthday. Luckily for me, the Historical Society is older than I am. So if you could get the lights.
Wow.
Here comes food. I'll need just not all of them. So thank you. Okay. We must consider Thanksgiving to be a holiday that is peculiarly American. But as with everything else in this country, Thanksgiving is a holiday that is a hybrid of old world traditions and new world traditions. The traditions and myths that surround Thanksgiving are primarily based on the early years of the Plymouth colony. You are all probably familiar with what happened that first winter. Half the colonists died. It was a very harsh winter. There was a lot of concern over whether the first harvest would occur. And when it did come and it was a good harvest, there was a great celebration with the neighboring Indians. But where did the idea for this celebration come from? What the Pilgrims did, in fact, was hold a traditional English harvest celebration called Harvest Home. In agrarian societies, as far back as you care to go, the success of a harvest was the source of and cause for a lot of joy and revelry in a village. Harvest home celebrations mark the end of seasonal tasks in a farming community, involving the entire community. And at the same time, it's a way for that community to express gratitude for the fact that the harvest has come in. And the festivities were not confined to a single day the way Thanksgiving is today. They would go on for many, many days. This was a very highly ritualized event. It wasn't a sort of catch-as-catch kind of thing. There was usually a harvest lord. There was usually a harvest lord who would be hired by the master of a piece of property or the landowner to supervise all of the activities. He would give the reapers who were collecting all the harvest in in the various fields their positions. He was the only one who could signal them whether it was time to begin work, to end work, when they would get breaks, things like that. A visitor to England in 1598 wrote that their last load of corn they crowned with flowers, having besides an image richly dressed by which they signify Ceres, the goddess of grain. And even though if you asked someone in the 17th century who Ceres was, they wouldn't know, these traditions and rituals extended far enough back so that they did involve ancient deities. They take this image, this grain image, and they keep moving about, while the men and women and men and maidservants riding through the streets in the cart shout as loud as they can till they arrive at the barn. Once the grain was in the barn, the harvest feast began. Now, it probably won't surprise very many of you to know that the cooking would be done by the housewives, their daughters and servants. Can you put is that a little fuzzy? I can't tell. It does? Okay. What we have here is an image from the 17th century. You've got a woman making pies on the left, another woman doing a combination of stews at the top, roasting at the bottom. But sort of keep this image of a kitchen in mind, because when we get to 17th century, either New England or Virginia, whichever you prefer, or Maryland, it's going to look very, very different. Here's another slide depicting the kinds of activities that British housewives would be involved in, all of them to prepare for a meal. Now, if you think preparing for the holidays today is a chore, the typical feast for your average farmer in the 17th century, according to cookbooks of the time, was 48 dishes. And in the fashion of that time, and imagine cooking those 48 dishes in something.
That other electronic thing we had, an extension cord here.
As small as this kitchen or that kitchen. And this is for your average farmer. This is not for somebody of upper class. In the fashion of that time, you would not just merely put the dishes on the table. If you were having a feast or a special occasion, there was a very particular order on how you place things, what was brought out first, and how it would be brought out. According to a cookbook of the time, for a humble feast, you would have for your first course 16 dishes. And these dishes would start off with a shield of brawn, which is the skin of a boar filled with jellied meat and mustard. You then move on to boiled capon, boiled beef, a chine of beef roasted, a neat's tongue roasted, a pig roasted, meat pies baked, a goose roasted, a swan roasted, a turkey roasted, a haunch of venison roasted, followed by a kid with pudding in the belly, an olive pie, capons, custards, and quiches. And that's just your first course. I don't know about you, but I think I probably need to explain about that.
Christina, excuse me a moment. We're going to try to get a separate light for you so we can put out the overhead lights and your beautiful slides will show.
Okay.
So we've been scrounging around for an extension cord, which have
There's an orange one that I have right out there.
Oh, I put it back in the case because it looked as though you weren't going to be using it. Okay, so what I've been reading to you is for feasts for special occasions. For the average harvest feast, the menu would probably be a bit more modest, but it would still include goose, other kinds of roasted meats and bacon, corn custards and cakes, and in the 17th century the word corn meant any kind of grain. It did not mean the ear of corn that you have at barbecue today. Corn custards and cakes, and a special dish called frumenting, which is a traditional harvest pudding that would be made with grain cooked in milk with currants, spices, and wine. And I can attest to the fact that it actually does taste good. You'd also be drinking a lot of homebrewed beer and ale. In the early 17th century, if you drank the water, it would probably kill you. So everybody drank some version of beer or ale. The young and the very old would get milk, and everybody else, and I mean, beer and ale was it. The proportion of alcohol would vary depending on how you brewed it, so you wouldn't give your children alcohol or beer with the same kind of alcohol content that you would give to adults, but they still pretty much drank it. Now, besides food and drink, there were also traditional activities that would go on, such as dancing. There'd be marching through all of the fields. There'd be special harvest songs that were handed down, and in some cases the songs were only sung in a particular village, and you couldn't find them anyplace else within the county, let alone in other parts of England. So this was very particularized ritual. And the waving of kern dollies. And this is an example of different kinds of kern dollies. What you're looking at is either grain or straw that has been plaited or braided into fanciful shapes. Now, in some places today, you can find them on the East Coast, and they're called kitchen witches or things like that. But basically, where it comes from is the tradition of the harvest festival. And sometimes favors would be made from these corn dollies by farm laborers, and they would be given to their sweethearts as love tokens. Those favors that were to be worn by girls displayed ears of grain. Those that were worn by the men were only straw. Another sort of throwback to the idea of grain as a symbol for fertility and the harvest festival as celebrating all of that. These corn dollies would also be used as decoration for the carts that would bring in the grain. They would be used to decorate the barn where you stored the grain, or any other large building that would be used as part of the harvest home celebration. And these are still made in England. In fact, these at the bottom are called harvest devils because they're supposed to sort of look like mischievous sheaves of grains. In addition, men would demonstrate their prowess with firearms. There would be displays of musket shooting. There would also be displays of the longbow. But the bottom line, as far as a harvest festival was concerned, was the eating and drinking. That was the primary activity, and for some people, the only activity that really made it worthwhile. And it kind of capped off a whole lot of hard work over the course of an agricultural year. This is what you really work towards. Getting a good harvest, making sure that you had enough food to eat for the coming year and that you had enough seed for the following year. So when the Pilgrims were able to bring in a successful harvest in Plymouth that first year, they celebrated the way any other English farmers would have celebrated. They had a harvest festival. They danced. Surprising and shocking, but true. They played bowls, an early form of lawn bowling. In the 17th century, sports activities were considered very important. And so, for those of you who may feel a little uncomfortable about the fact that your husbands are either playing football or watching football on Thanksgiving Day, it's completely traditional and legit. So there you are. They also demonstrated prowess with firearms. And I would suggest that in 17th century Plymouth and Virginia and Maryland, if they had this kind of festival, they would do this partly for tradition, and at least with the Pilgrims who had Indians there, partly as a way of demonstrating the fact that they had superior firepower and were a force to be reckoned with. So it served two functions at once. But they also ate. Now, in the event of inclement weather, they could go indoors. But as you can see from this slide, that's very dark. That's about as dark as it would have been inside the house. It would have been cramped. It would not have been a whole lot of fun. So they would have had their feast out of doors, Indians and settlers mingling together, eating on benches outside houses, eating in open areas within the village, and generally having a good time. Now, our knowledge of what occurred that first Thanksgiving comes from a letter written by Edward Winslow, who was one of the hierarchy, one of the higher men in the village. He wrote a letter to a friend of his in 1621 in December, and he wrote that our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men fowling, so that we might, after a more special manner, rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labor. Winslow goes on to say that the celebrations lasted a week, with the local Wampanoag Indians arriving in the middle of these festivities and staying for 3 days. So, as with the celebrations in England, when they did it right. You had a week's worth of feasting, dancing, singing, general festivities. Now, Thanksgiving, as we know it today, is really a combination of 2 events. There's the Harvest Home celebration that is held after the harvest comes in, and there was also an event called a formal day of Thanksgiving. This was something that would be proclaimed by authorities to focus on a particular event. And in the 17th century records, there are numerous instances where a day of Thanksgiving is called because a drought is broken, because delayed fish that haven't made it upstream all of a sudden are making it upstream, pestilence that was in one village managed to completely bypass your village. Anything that manifested sort of the hand of God protecting the village was worthy of having a day of Thanksgiving called to celebrate it. And if you had a day of Thanksgiving like this, you didn't feast, you didn't dance, you would usually go to a meeting house, or if you didn't have a meeting house in the village, go to a smaller house that belonged to an individual, and you would basically pray and listen to sermons. Naturally, our Thanksgiving does not really follow that kind of model. But what you have is this amalgam of the idea of giving thanks for something put onto the harvest celebration. Thanksgiving was celebrated in a variety of locations, both in New England, in Maryland, in Virginia. But it remained mostly a New England regional holiday until the middle of the 19th century. In an attempt to bolster the spirits of the Union during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed the day as a national holiday in 1863, and he set the date as the last Thursday in November. Franklin Roosevelt changed it to the 4th Thursday in November in 1939. Now, it should be pointed out that placing the holiday in November is completely arbitrary. This is not Plymouth in November, but it is Plymouth in early December. And they would not have had a harvest festival at this time of year. I mean, it just, unless you're really into having a good snowball fight, it wouldn't have been what they wanted. By celebrating the harvest when the harvest came in, you would be doing it at some point in September or possibly in early October. Now, despite the existence of Thanksgiving as an official designated national holiday in the mid-19th century, celebrations of the harvest separate from that still took place in many farming communities across the country. In Maryland, for instance, up to about 1925, harvesters were liberally supplied with a drink of cold water, ginger, and molasses. And they always had an extra dinner given to them. In other areas, ginger beer and eggnog was standard, as was homemade beer. So, what is the traditional food that would be eaten in Thanksgiving? Naturally enough, all contemporary Thanksgivings, and since about the Victorian period, all previous Thanksgivings have been centered on this bird. And I think that what I'm going to do is take a little bit of a break here. And we'll get into the food section in earnest at that point. No, I'm not going to do that. Actually, I thought
Christine wants it.
whatever it's called. That's fine.
I said does she?
She's not great, good idea.
Everybody's supposed to get up and eat, right? Something's happening next?
Well, look at the,
But we're supposed to set an example of what's going to follow later when they drink.
Kansas.
they do. Really?
I think we still have some. The point I'm making is, we saw the Olympics.
Yeah, it still continues, the whole tradition.
So I'll tell you about
Thank you.
what we saw.
Thank you.
I used to volunteer with Bob and Matt. And then I worked I haven't been down there in a long time. Is that open now? You got that? We're going down there on the 12th of December. You going to the feast?
Oh, yeah. Waiting for the coffee.
They would open the house, I believe, on Sundays for tours. Very involved. You know, we got nailed by the budget. I talked to him a few months ago. There they are. He asked me, John's involved with working out something with them and the commission. Something he's working on. I assume so. Last time I talked to you, I think it was really
I love the farm
well, Lanny's. Yeah, she works with almost being out there. Yeah, they kind of, I think they kind of agreed with me for a while, and then they changed their mind. But I'm sort of losing my boss to work there. That's what it is. Really, that way we know. It's really sort of one of those things that's halfway. Yeah.
Over a couple of things, and also to relate a question that was asked to me regarding the water, because I don't think I can state enough times how much of a prejudice there was for people living in England at this time against drinking water. And when I worked at Plymouth Plantation, people would say, well, but you know, when they came here, they had all this fresh water. They had springs, they had unpolluted rivers. Why wouldn't they drink the water? If you drank water out of the Thames in the 17th century, it would have killed you. Because rivers, yeah, it's less polluted today.
It's
than
less polluted,
yes.
but if you want to drink it,
You don't want to drink it.
The salmon had returned to London
Finally.
some years ago.
The all of the rivers were used as sewers are used today. That was the way you got rid of all of your waste. And after a couple of centuries, or a couple of thousands of years, depending on how these things work, of not drinking the water because you're always told that it will be bad, when you come to an area that even has fresh water, you still will not drink it. And in his history of Plymouth, William Bradford writes about how one year the barley crop failed. And even though Plymouth has a number of very sweet springs, and they talk about the fact that the water tasted delicious, it was this really fresh and refreshing sweet spring, the fact that they didn't have barley to brew their beer was considered a tragedy. The idea of drinking water was just so alien to them that it's like expecting children to drink beer today. It's like, oh my God, we've never served these kids beer today, and yet that was commonplace. To get back to the idea of what you did at a harvest and what you ate. Again, it would be local food. There'd be a lot of it. You'd eat a lot of roasted meats, roasted fowl, fish if you could get it, but depending on what part of England you were from, you might not get it. And it's important to sort of remember that more than anything else, the whole idea behind this was to celebrate what was going on and celebrate it in a way that you took advantage of what you had at hand that you could really use. So,
You have another bulb?
uh-oh.
Oh, not again.
Again? It just went.
Yeah, we got that.
Comedy of errors.
Here's the case.
We had another ball.
Last time it was the wrong ball. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's a good
Those things
case.
don't last very long.
Not when you're moving them around. They don't jostle very well.
No, as a matter of fact,
Well, you've all seen the slide of a turkey. You all know what a turkey looks like. He's changing the bulb. I'll just move on. The traditional Thanksgiving menu. If I ask you what you have for Thanksgiving, what is your answer?
Turkey,
Cranberry.
potatoes, cranberry, corn,
creamed onions.
oysters.
Okay. Ham. Now that's a regional thing.
What kind of red blood animals do they have in?
Red-blooded animals in New England?
Red meat animals.
The first winter, they did not have any cattle. Cattle came later on, but they had venison, which for someone in the 17th century was a treat because you didn't hunt deer in England. Deer was the private preserve of the nobility. In fact, unless you were of the nobility, you did not hunt. And so the fact that during that first Thanksgiving, the Indians brought them no less than 5 deer, meant that they were literally eating like kings. They ate in a way that they could never have approached in England. Okay, this traditional Thanksgiving menu, all of the foods that you've mentioned, are all dishes that reflect the kinds of things that would have been eaten by the early settlers, whether in Massachusetts or in the Chesapeake. But it has a kind of Victorian twist to it. What the English did with what they had is very different from what you would expect. There he is, Mr. Gobbler, taken on a side road in Virginia. Okay, the letter from Winslow that I mentioned earlier, he tells us that the 4 men that were sent out by the governor in one day managed to kill as much fowl as would have served the entire company for over a week. So they managed in one day to really bring in some animals. This wild fowl could have included turkey. We're not sure, because even though turkeys are mentioned in Bradford's history, in all of the archaeological excavations that have ever taken place in Plymouth, not a single turkey bone has ever been recovered. So, whether they ate turkey that first Thanksgiving or not, no one is really sure. They also might have eaten geese and ducks. Now, the colonists, surprisingly enough, would have been very familiar with turkeys. Turkeys were served in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. They had been brought to Europe by the Spanish and very quickly found favor with the population. In fact, turkey was considered such a delicacy that it very quickly replaced both swan and peacock as the food of choice for your special meal. And that's really saying something because both peacock and swan make a very dynamite presentation when you do all the feathers out, served roasted on a large platter. Other foods that they might have served then include fish and seafood, such as cod and lobster, which are considered New England specialties, but also clams and oysters. And would have had crab. Various kinds of squashes, including pumpkins. You would have had breads or puddings, this time made of corn because their English wheat crop failed. It did not do very well. It took a while to get English wheat established. And so they relied on what we now call corn to make all of their foods and bread. And local fruits, such as cranberry, peach, and plum. If all of this sounds familiar, it really should, because local variations notwithstanding, Englishmen along the entire Atlantic seaboard coast survived during their first years on a diet that was really a combination of native plants and animals, and those plants and animals that they brought over from England and that managed to survive in the new environment. It is also a diet that has survived in one form or another since colonial days. The very fact that you mentioned foods that would have been familiar to an Englishman of the 17th century shows that not a whole, the way it's served has changed, but the basic foods are still there. Now this slide is a depiction of a late 18th century kitchen. And you can see a lot of things in here that will be familiar to Marylanders. And, well, things you don't really eat today. You don't eat the turtle, but certainly turtle would have been popular. You've got your wild fowl, you've got crabs in a bushel basket underneath. And in this 1844 depiction of a southern kitchen, you've got turkey, you've got your squashes, and this could very well be the setting for a Thanksgiving feast in the 19th century. Now, keep in mind this kitchen and this kitchen look like. Because whether you do 48 dishes for a feast, or whether you do even 10 dishes for a feast, in the 17th century, this is the kitchen you're going to cook it in. No, not even an oven, unless you manage to have a Dutch oven. This is a 17th century recreated house based on archaeological evidence in Plymouth, Massachusetts. What you have is a corner hearth. You don't even have a fireplace. You have a chimney with a very heavy canvas that is providing a bit of a draft coming up. You cook on the coals in here using either this kind of iron kettle that's got legs to stand on it, or cooking it. I don't know how easily you can tell this, but there are hooks on these andirons where you could place meat on a spit. Preparations for any kind of meal for the 17th century woman in early colonial times, whether she was in New England or in the Chesapeake, was primitive. This is probably as much space as she had for food preparation. Yeah, it's really cozy. This window is one of two windows in the building. And as you can see, it's not very big. What you've got for a table is wood slab on a couple of barrels. That makes it very easy. When you're finished with what you have to do, you just put it up, get it out of the way, and you go on to whatever the next function for that particular space is going to be. So, the deer and the fowl that were brought in by both Governor Bradford's men and the Indians would probably have been done out of doors over large fires. Pardon?
I would hope.
You'd have to, because all you could possibly do in this would be your vegetables and smaller meats. It's a real art form, cooking like this. You'd be surprised. Actually, after a while, it's not that bad. I lived here for 2 years, and it wasn't. I didn't mind not having an oven.
What is the time frame of the earlier picture of the kitchen that had all the animals and other utensils in it? Was larger kitchen?
This one? This is in 1844.
The one before that?
This is late 1700s.
Unless we a couple others more fancy than the ones we're talking about.
Well, it's also 100, 160, 170 years later, too.
That's your kitchen house or
This here that I'm showing you is a corner
something? Corner in the house.
corner in the house.
That's the one.
In the room that was that.
That would be either a separate room or
Separate.
in the south it would have been a separate room. So, now while the ingredients all sound familiar to you, they were prepared in 17th century fashion. When I say English food, what do you think of?
Pork pies.
Steak and kidney pie.
Kidney.
Does the word
Steak and
bland ring a bell?
Yeah.
That's very much what I heard.
Uninteresting. Overcooked. Pardon? Yeah. These are words that you cannot possibly use when you talk about 17th century English food. Dishes would be highly seasoned with spices such as cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace, even if the dish were made of chicken or fish. I'm going to hear a lot of oohs in this next couple of pages, I can just tell.
So would the food be highly spiced because that's the way they liked it, or because they had to do it to preserve it?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
just how
All
does it taste?
three. You not only had meats that were highly seasoned, the sauces were also highly spiced. And you not only had a lot of spice, such as, and when you take something like cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace, and then throw black pepper into it, it makes the cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace that much sharper. You really notice it's like giving it an extra kick. And so you had that, but in addition, you also used a lot of sweet and sour in conjunction with it. Things weren't either or. So that everything was just, your taste buds were constantly going. There was nothing plain about any of this food. Once the English were introduced to sugar in the mid-16th century, sugar went in and on everything. They developed a love affair with sugar that is not to be believed. The seasoning and the saucing was both cultural preference, but it was also because of sort of the pre-refrigeration reality. It was not only a way of preserving the food, but once that food started to go bad, you really needed a way to cover up the taste. You did. You absolutely did. I've brought some recipes that I'd like to hand out. I do not recommend, with the exception of the stewed pompion, I do not recommend experimentation with these. Unless there's a relative that sort of lives at your house who you'd really like to get rid of. because this will do the trick.
I thought it was
What?
There's no separate.
the relative.
They're separate ones. Yes, they are.
Thank you.
Now, I don't know how easily you'll be able to see these. Anybody here like oysters?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't know how readily you'll be able to read this oyster recipe, and it's, apart from being a recipe, it's charming as literature, so I'll just read it for you.
Do you want to turn the light on?
Well, I can read it. Take of the greatest oysters drawn from the shells and parboil them in verjuice. Verjuice is a very common 17th century
Why do you need a red one?
food ingredient. Verjuice is the juice of sour crab apples. And what you would do is you would go out and you would collect your crab apples, and in 17th century parlance, you would let these apples sweat, which means you basically let them decompose. And once they get to the right consistency, you put them through a sieve, and the juice that you have is verjuice. Yeah.
What, are you saying bear juice?
Verjuice, V-E-R-J-U-I-C. About the closest equivalent you would have today would be to take a really strong and sour cider vinegar and cut it with lemon juice. Then put them into a colander and let all the moisture run from them till they be as dry as possible. Then raise up the coffin, which is your pie crust, and lay them in. Then put to them good store of currants, fine powdered sugar, whole mace, whole cloves, whole cinnamon, and a nutmeg sliced. Dates cut, and a good store of sweet butter. Then cover it and only leave a vent hole. When it is baked, draw it, or take it out of its container. Take white wine and white wine vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, and sweet butter, and melt it together. Then first trim the lid therewith and candy it with sugar. Then pour the rest in at the vent hole and shake it well. And so set it into the oven again for a little space, and so serve it up. The dish edges trimmed with sugar. Now, some use to put to this pie onions, slice and shred, but that is referred to discretion and to the pleasure of the taste. Needless to say, if you were to serve someone this dish today, they'd probably never speak to you again, especially if they're very fond of oysters. As you can
Tried these yourself?
We have to put these
I
up in the
have
kitchen.
tried.
Were you trying to turn away? Oh, different, okay.
Not our
The, I have used, now this recipe comes from a book called The English Housewife, which was a very popular self-help book in the early 17th century. And when I worked at Plymouth Plantation, we started a food waste program and began doing some research into translating these recipes for a 20th century cook. Some of the recipes actually are quite good. There were some combinations of, for instance, chicken, raisins, or currants soaked in brandy that you would use in the equivalent of a chicken pot pie, that you might add some shredded or crumbled up egg into, and it tastes almost Moroccan because of the way you have the cinnamon sort of working in tandem with the sweetness of the currants, and you've got and the meat inside. Most of the recipes are for a 20th century palate are just impossible. Even something as simple as cooking vegetables, and they cooked vegetables to death back then because it was believed that if you ate it raw, it would kill you. And this was both for fruits and vegetables. I mean, you never ate a fresh fruit, ever. People would probably start making a shroud if they saw you eat that. You have something as simple as spinach, You throw in butter, okay. You throw in a little nutmeg or a little mace, okay. Once you start throwing in the vinegar and the sugar, or the verjuice and the sugar, they were addicted to sugar in a very big way, and that is reflected through so many of their recipes. Needless to say, when you get to the desserts, you really overload on sugar, and there's a lot of marzipan type almond paste or nut pastes with a lot of sugar and egg white in them. But sugar, vinegar, and lots of spices are used routinely. I mean, there is just no stinting on using it. Even with something like a fresh fruit or a vegetable, where you wouldn't think you'd have to either preserve it or cover up the bad taste of it, because you could just go into your backyard and pull it out of the ground. That's where you can really tell that it's a combination of preservation and covering up and cultural preference, because they just go for that every single time. Now, in Plymouth and St. Mary's, especially during the early days of the colonies, sugar and honey were not that available. So you think, aha, they got out of it here. Well, no, they didn't. Because even though sugar and honey were scarce, dark beer, such as porter, which is also very sweet, would be used in conjunction with what you were cooking, as well as a lot of fresh fruit. You throw that in the cooking to sweeten it as well. So no matter how you cut it, what you're going to get is going to be sweet and spicy and tart, all at the same time.
Christina, I had a question. In terms of the spices, a lot of those dishes have been available locally. How did they keep up their supply?
They'd come in on ships.
So is that
And you would end up modifying it in some way. For example, if you couldn't get black pepper, you could grow chili peppers. And the dried chili peppers can act as a preservative in the same way that black pepper would.
Where did they get the sugar?
Well, in England, it was imported. And you'd get loads of sugar. In the colonies, because sugar was scarce, you went to other sources. You either found a natural local source of honey that you could use, or you would use dark sweet beer, or you would use fruit as a sweetener.
Well, when you say sugar, you're not talking about granulated sugar then?
You did not get granulated sugar the way you think of it. Sugar came in loaves, and you would break a hunk off. Although you would certainly, depending on what the recipe called for, when they talk about powdered sugar, you would take a bit of it and you would grind it up into a powdered form.
Christina, the sugar, a lot of the sugar cane that Spain found out that they could grow sugar cane on the Canary Islands, and so that was one of the sources, one of the major sources of sugar for Europe was the Canary Islands.
How about the processing of it, though, into sugar? Was that done
Well,
too?
Spain did that, sure, because they wanted to get the most money out of it. That was a major fundraiser for them.
And we come in hard
Right.
cones,
Mm-hmm.
and you just flip
Sugar
block,
loaves.
little sugar snips that you
Right.
you cut off what you want.
And it was pretty dirty and pretty, very unrefined.
Where
But
do they
that
find
was
maple sugar? Where do they get the maple sugar?
the maple sugar is a local source of sugar that they would have gotten in New England. You don't have maple trees down here. That
No,
is
I
something
mean,
indigenous.
Oh, yes, we do.
right away.
Sure.
You do have maple trees? Sugar maple?
Not sugar.
Well, not right here in this area,
No,
but
in
in
West
Maryland,
Virginia.
mountains of Maryland, Virginia, all over the
Monterey,
lots
Huh.
of sugar bushes in there.
So, do you know when they realized that they could get sugar from the maple trees up there?
That
that
I
was
do not know.
probably.
I would
They
imagine.
probably
Wonder if
taken
the
too
Indians
long.
already,
Indians
Indians
probably
probably
know
knew
what
what
we're
we're
doing.
doing.
Probably
Those
something
Indians
they
didn't live
thought.
there all that time and be able to find that maple syrup. Because you can take maple syrup maple sap right out of the tree, and I've done it. when it's running.
Does it have to be a sugar maple, or can it be any kind of maple?
Any maple will produce sweet sap, but a sugar maple produces the most and the best. Take us a red maple right here, and you wound that tree in the spring of the year, and it'll produce a lot of sap that's slightly sweet to the taste.
Well, Susan, we're going to have to experiment this spring.
We'll go tap our trees.
That's right.
I don't know how you'll do with that red maple, but if it is a red maple. And it takes about, I think, 30 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup.
And then how much sugar does that produce if you put that syrup down to a sugar corn?
I really don't know. The way they used to do it in Canada was they just kept cooking it until it got hard, and then I guess you'd probably wind up with a lot less than a gallon if you got it down to a sugar form, unless you just let it sit and crystallize. That takes too much time. And it will crystallize. Crystallize is beautiful.
Of the juice to make a pound of sugar. Maple sugar.
Yes, it is. Turn that off. So essentially, all of the sort of variations on what we do for Thanksgiving and the variations on the local cuisines that we have that come out of New England and out of the Chesapeake stem from these initial encounters between the colonists and sort of the local plants and animals. The hardness of that first winter has spawned a variety of traditions, Thanksgiving being the most obvious one, but there are also traditions that come out of sort of that Thanksgiving tradition as well, and one that I have read in a number of sources, but with varying numbers, is the tradition of setting the Thanksgiving table with the plate turned over. And underneath the plate, when you lift it up, what you find are grains of corn. The number varies depending on what sources you read. Either 3 grains of corn, 5 grains of corn, I've read 7 grains of corn. The corn is supposed to symbolize ships that arrived in Massachusetts bringing fresh supplies of food and especially grain when the colony was hardest hit. And in the folklore that I've read, they always refer to it as in Massachusetts. Up until 1697, Plymouth and Massachusetts were 2 separate colonies. So whether the folklore tradition stems from Massachusetts Bay or whether it stems from Plymouth, Massachusetts with the Pilgrims, I don't know. But it's kind of an interesting tradition to incorporate that people are still trying to remember the fact that there was a lot of hardship that first winter, apart from the fact that there was a lot of food that people were able to enjoy as well. And kind of towards the end of this, I'd be interested in finding out if there are any unusual or traditional either foodways or folkways coming out of Prince George's County or Maryland that deal with Thanksgiving and deal with the local foods that are produced here.
They're probably smoked.
I know that I've often read, I don't know the recipe, I don't know as much about it as some people would, but they traditionally in St. Mary's, I'm often told they use a ham with a spinach stuffing.
I don't think that's
How about
really
oysters,
related
too?
to that.
Oysters, I think.
Oysters.
Yeah, but turkey stuffing.
But not in a pod.
No,
With
not
berries.
all.
No, nothing like that.
Part of the stuffing.
Or as a separate dish.
As a separate
We've
dish.
always served them as a separate side dish.
If anyone is adventurous, the stewed pumpkin is good. But use the 20th century version, please.
Was there any
the Seeds of Change exhibit down there shows how the American experience was taken back to Europe. Do you find any of the foods from the Plymouth area being taken back to England and affecting their diet at all?
Well, it's not a New England food, but certainly turkey. The fact that the Spanish came into contact with turkeys on the North American continent and brought them back to Europe and introduced it, and it became popular enough to replace more traditional foods.
That was before 1620, though, right?
That was before 1620. Corn is an excellent case in point, although whether the corn would have come from New England or whether the corn would have come from the Chesapeake, that I couldn't tell you. But certainly the introduction of a corn that is edible for humans as opposed to something that could be used for animal fodder is important.
I don't know, go way back to colonial days, in the early days of the Maryland Agricultural College, which was the University of Maryland, records which depict what they were trying to improve on with horticulture and other techniques, and they suggested things that were back to the England.
What is interesting are the sort of the food prejudices and the things that we take for granted today, or the things that we consider luxuries. In reading Bradford's account of life in Plymouth Colony, it amazes me when he complains about the fact that nothing else was available, and so they were forced to eat lobster. Or they're forced to eat some of these other kinds of foods. And, you think about it today, and it's, oh, well, that would really be a hardship, wouldn't it? They repeatedly talk about just, having to eat more and more oysters because their hunting has failed. Or they, for whatever reason, things that we consider to be such a special treat today that just, no thank you. Too abundant. I think in the case of shellfish, there was probably also a slight prejudice against it because they're bottom feeders. And so in the 17th century, there was a very strong tradition of correspondence. If something looked like something else, it was assumed to be like what it looked like. You find this in medicine a lot. If a plant is shaped like a heart, then the assumption was, well, this must be good for the heart. And because shellfish are bottom eaters, they were considered to be dirty. And you wouldn't want to eat something that is inherently dirty. So, yeah, it's a hardship having to eat lobster and oysters.
But if you had nothing but that in your diet,
Then
you'd
there it
certainly
is.
be deficient in some vitamins and minerals or whatever, protein or whatever you would need. And nothing else, I can understand that.
Because there were many clams.
Yep. A lot of clams. But they're also, any kind of shellfish is going to be a bottom eater, so, very much so. Very much so.
I had a question. When you were showing the plank in the kitchen, could you talk about some of the cooking utensils, what they had to, how you actually did prepare a meal with what you had there? And the one before it with the fireplace, I think you just had the Dutch oven and...
Yeah. Well, this isn't really a Dutch oven.
Oh,
It might be if it had a different lid.
That has a wooden lid, doesn't it?
It's a wooden lid, so you couldn't put any coals on top. As you might imagine from what you see in this kind of setup, the most common foods we wanted two kinds. You either broiled it in front of the fire, or you cooked it into some kind of soup or stew. As you pointed out, the English boil everything. Some things never change. And what you would have done is, if you were lucky enough to be able to set something like this up, you would use this for, chopping up your vegetables, preparing everything that needed to be prepared to go into, for everything that you would need to go into this. Most commonly, you would use a bone with some kind of combination of root vegetables because those were the easiest. And the way the village was set up in the 17th century, I don't know whether you, let me see if I can get it back. This is the way they assumed the village would have looked like based on a wide variety of both archaeological and archaeological records, the written record, and also some villages in England. What you would have had is a village that was palisaded. All of your main fields would be on the outside. What you had back here behind all of these houses were basically your kitchen gardens, where you would grow all of your root vegetables, whatever you needed for the kitchen, and your herbs. And the herbs back then were not herbs as we think of today, where you go down the seasoning aisle and you get what you get. You had herbs fell into one of four categories, and they were not mutually exclusive. Any herb could have more than one category. But you had your cooking herbs, your scenting herbs, your healing herbs, and then herbs for dyeing. An herb is a kind of general term. An onion is an herb. Carrots were herbs. So you would have your little kitchen gardens in the back here, which is where you begin your food for whatever you're cooking, the stew that you're cooking that day. I'm done with that. And actually, in much the same fashion as you see here, you would prepare whatever you needed to, and you would hang it over the fire. This trammel is adjustable. You would raise and lower it as you needed heat. You could set this either directly on the fire. If you wanted it to cook a little slower, or depending on what was in it, you could take coals away from the fire, put it to the side, put your kettle in and cook. This would be used for your spit meats. And usually if you were going to spit something and cook it in front of the fire, you'd have a drip pan underneath it to collect the fat and the juices to make a gravy or sauce with. As fireplaces develop and as your circumstances hopefully progress, you would go from something as simple as this to more elaborate trammels where you could do 2, 3, or 4 kettles at a time off of an arm. And as you have what is considered today a regular traditional fireplace, you would have baking ovens set up so that you didn't have to go the route of a Dutch oven where you set the kettle in coals and then put the coals on top.
Would there have been a hole for a chimney?
There is a hole for a chimney here, yes. There is a chimney that goes up, but in place of a flue or some kind of vent to put over the fire, you have that canvas.
I can relate to that sort of cooking for you. About 40 years ago, in the early 50s, I belonged to a hunting camp down in Highland County, Virginia. And Highland County is about as far from the Appalachians you could get back in those days, I think. County seat's Monterey, and Monterey is, in fact, is the maple syrup capital of the East, I think. But anyway, we had a little farmhouse that we hunted out of, and an old lady came in to cook for us, and that's all she used was that fireplace and Dutch ovens. And she baked bread, biscuits, and you name it, and they were delicious.
When I lived
She wouldn't use anything else, huh?
When I was in Ireland in the early 1970s, I lived in a stone cottage and in County Tipperary, and this was it. It was both cooking and heating.
Yeah, and it works beautifully. I have a wood stove at home, and I have a Dutch oven. I bake potatoes in it, and it's just delicious. Put a little rack at the bottom, and just sit on the wood stove. And, it's very delicious. You never tasted the baked potato so good.
Yeah. The taste of the food that you get from here. And there are all kinds of tricks that you learn as with any kind of cooking. If we were baking bread, a lot of people would come in and they would see the Dutch oven in the side. You know, you're sitting in coals, you've got coals banked on the sides, you've got coals on top of it. Well, how do you know if the bread is done? And what we discovered was that if you take a couple of maple leaves, green maple leaves, and put them on top of the bread, as soon as you smelled the maple leaves burning, you knew that the bread was done. Because as long as there was moisture in the kettle, those leaves would stay moist. But once the moisture was sucked out of the leaves and they actually started turning in terms of the smell, then you knew that the bread was ready to go. And so out it came, and rarely burned on the bottom.
It's a nice timer.
Yeah, it was very efficient. You just had to make sure that you didn't have a heavy cold that day, or you'd lose that.
I think we have to remind people that 17th and 18th century that the majority of people had very few cooking utensils.
Mm-hmm.
If they had a pot and
A spit.
a spit, well, that would be. They would probably have their andirons.
Yeah. This is
And,
really all you need. It's amazing. You can get how much you can do with just this little amount.
But people just didn't have a bunch of different pans to do a bunch of different things.
And what you would have eaten out of is this.
Right.
You didn't have individual plates, saucers, cups. Spoons were it. You had a spoon and you had your knife. Forks were only being introduced into the French court at this time, and so you wouldn't have found it.
What would the sweets have been? You said that the sweets were even sweeter than the main dishes, the desserts. What might there have been?
Well, you have the kinds of things that you might expect. Fruit pies, for instance, fruit tarts.
That's what I was wondering.
Loaded down with sugar, and one of the things, it's one of my favorite kinds of desserts. They were very liberal in their use of something called rose water, which you find used a lot in Middle Eastern cooking today, and in some French cooking. When you, I don't know whether you're familiar with it. It comes in little blue plastic bottles from Europe. You open it up, and it's roses. Rose water is brewed from the leaves of damask roses, and it imparts the taste of rose to whatever you eat. It's very subtle. A lot of candied flowers are popular. Candied violets, candied rose petals. You candy angelica flowers. Angelica is an herb that tastes like licorice, and the flower head is very similar to Queen Anne's lace. So that would look beautiful when you candy it. And you could either serve these as little treats in and of themselves, or you could put them on top of the tart as decoration. You might make a sweet kelkashol, which was a kind of cross between a quiche and an omelet in terms of its consistency, but very eggy. You could easily, by adding rose water and leaving out things like the onions, make a sweet tart for a dessert. And then there would be the almond paste confections. But you wouldn't really do almond paste you wouldn't find it in a village setting like this. That is something that you would find at an elaborate feast in an upper class home, where they would spin these beautiful, elaborate, fanciful animals and buildings out of almond paste and spun sugar. You could just break that off and eat it.
When did the concept of eating out at a commercial place, a diner or a cafe, or developing in colonies?
In the colonies?
Well, yes.
You don't have the first restaurant with private, individualized seating until the French Revolution. You have eating places on the continent and in England that you could go to where you would be served in what we call family style. People sitting at long tables, and you never know who your neighbor is, or you'd have private clubs. And the fact that you never knew quite who you were sitting with was one of the reasons why the restaurant with private seating developed in France, because it was very useful for the revolutionaries to be able to sit and discuss their plans in private. In the United States, you would have had If you wanted to eat out, you could, I suppose, always go to a coach house, where again you'd be eating family style. But the idea of leaving the house for a meal is
Unless you were trapped.
yeah, unless you were traveling, there was just no need for it.
How is the table set up in your one-room house? Would you have just moved that plank over so everyone could sit?
No one would sit.
They would stand. You
You
didn't
just
have. You didn't even have
stand.
any wooden stools or.
You might have a stool or two, but basically you would just serve everything into your bowl, and you would either eat in there. This is a very well lit space because it's got a fresh coat of whitewash, and the whitewash that they use at Plymouth has a very high content of ground shell in it, and the iridescence in the shell really helps reflect both the sunlight coming in through the two windows and the firelight. But you're seeing this photograph. When I took this photograph, the whitewash was probably, I don't even think it was 2 years old. I would guarantee you that if you were to walk into this house today, unless it had a recent whitewash job, it would be very, very dingy. You spent as little time as possible in a house. You would stay outside and do as much as you could outside, if for no other reason than because it would be dark and dreary in here.
Is that a structure out on it?
Yeah, it is.
Is that square thing or mortar and pestle?
This isn't, no. This is,
A wall.
what is it called? A beetle. Or just like a hammer.
You see, the Department of Planning Commission has a smokehouse down at Brook Bay.
Uh-huh.
What that place? People smoking or repairing animals beforehand, having them dried and cured so they would be available sometime later. Only that practice.
Well, that was a common practice in England at the time. You smoked your meat. Your common ways of preserving meat were to either dry cure them. You would combination of salt, spices to dry cure, and smoking, or you would wet cure them by putting them in a barrel and some kind of pickling solution. So meat would be smoked over there as well. And I don't know how far back that goes in England, but that's not something that was discovered here in the colonies.
We had one kitchen where there seemed to be so many fowl, another things hanging around, and that's all cured meat that is waiting to be taken off the hook.
Yeah, you would hang your bacons and everything from the rafter, because if you didn't, there was always the possibility of animals getting at it, and there was less likelihood of an animal getting from this that was hanging.
As chimneys developed, a lot of people did not have a separate smokehouse or meat house, but cured their meats right in their chimney in the house. And then how long would the fowl hang there with the feathers on? Were they just killed and brought in? The sketch that you showed, was that just in preparation for a feast kind of thing, or would they have been hanging there for any length of time?
They might let it cure for a couple of days.
Right, they cured right there.
It's an amazing thing about a goose or any type of wild bird. We used to shoot grouse and hang them from the camp up in Canada for as much as a couple of weeks. You hang them till the head falls off, and then they're sweet. The meat is sweet. It is. But you don't puncture. You never puncture the paunch. You make sure that if you shot the thing and you puncture the paunch, you can't do that. You have to shoot the heads off or shoot them in the head or something, and then let them hang until they literally start just losing their innards through their neck, and then the meat is sweet. And that's what I understand they did to the geese back in England. Never refrigerate them, just hang them until the heads fall off.
Yep.
And that's the best meat you can get. Sounds weird, doesn't it?
Did you discuss any of the religious significance? I didn't hear the first part of it.
Well, there isn't a whole lot of religious significance, except in the use of the term Thanksgiving, which in the 17th century, the governor or the ruling political body would frequently call a day of Thanksgiving. In Plymouth, they called a day of Thanksgiving in 1622, for instance, because a summer-long drought broke, and they were able to rescue part of their crop, and they considered that to be justification for having a day of Thanksgiving. But if you had a day of Thanksgiving, you would spend it in the meeting house listening to a variety of Bible readings and sermons all day long. So that would be, there isn't really much religious significance in the Harvest Festival. If anything, it is a continuation of old pagan fertility rituals that go back, way back. And the fact that you can still find corn dolls today, as I was informed by someone in the audience, shows that, you know, some elements of that still continue, even if the uses that these things are put to has changed over time. But the tradition is still there. Did you have any questions?
No.
Oh, you had. I didn't.
No. I've had lots of them as you were going on, and now I can't remember what they were. I didn't want to interrupt you at the time. Well, shall we turn the lights on? And there's still some punch and things over here, and then we can talk some more and ask more questions if you have it.
No, I think that was great. Thanks.
Very good.
There's still cake and some coffee and punch. I've eaten most of the apples.
You try it and let me know what you think.
You know, it's dark. They're light. Come in the daytime. Maybe can you see it in the basement? Yeah, but well, we do have. You can see right there, because we don't have any lights upstairs anymore.
I remember him mentioning
I just think up through. Is there anything that you'd like to say? I got
But it was very good. They also raised trout.
Take some for later. Good night. Thank you for coming.
Right.
Have a safe trip home. Thank you.
Several years there, we had this camp, and there was an old, it was really an old settlers.
And in that case, you're going to get a different taste.
It had a modern kitchen. They always put a little bit in it. But that old lady, she wouldn't touch our kitchen. She'd come in and cook on that. She had all the stuff in the fireplace. Cooking her stews and stuff. And her Dutch ovens where she'd bake her bread and potatoes. And she used to make biscuits. And I'm trying to remember all the food. I never put her food in my life. And that old woman, she said, why don't you go in there and boil your water or something? Oh no, I don't know how to use that thing. I'm sure that the tradition of cooking that way has been handed down for many generations. And she was just living in an old mountain homestead there up in the mountains somewhere. We hired her for like an order to $1 or $2 a day. But she was glad to have the money.
They go up to the
Eating, okay, we'd go out and knock off some of the little fox squirrels.
That'll bring back all kinds of...
Yeah, ask him if he remembers. The old lady who ran the post office. She also
Their water meant to find the cleanest
right in the old schoolhouse, I guess.
I would be surprised.
Going back that far, I probably
National Historic Preservation Act in
1966. 52, 53.
This is the first time they used that
Last year I hunted there. Really a great experience. I didn't realize at the time what an experience it was. I look back on it now and boy, that was good stuff. It's like a Pioneer.
I got some extra.